My brothers and I, speaking of playing, used to love to play Lincoln Logs. Back in my day, my daughter's here on the front row. This is not the first time I've said back in my day, probably. It seemed like just about every house had a big tub of these iconic wooden building toys. One of my brothers figured out how to build houses with multiple adjoining rooms here and there, and windows and doors. One even had a garage. The little plastic people seemed so happy going in and out of his mansions, sitting in the living rooms and basking in all the natural light. My constructions were cubes, straight up and down, and dark as midnight inside due to lack of windows, which I never mastered building. I used to put the plastic figures down inside mine and pretend they were stuck in a corn silo. Engineering, construction, these are not my jam, not really. Needless to say, I've never built a house myself. Still, even I understand the need for a house to be built on a solid foundation. I can imagine the nightmare scenario of a builder having put together a gorgeous house, a real work of art, only to find that the foundation wasn't right. That builder might choose to go ahead and continue with construction, and eventually the house might come crashing down in a heap of wood and stone, ruining the builder's reputation, hurting the people inside. Or she might choose to dismantle the building and strengthen the foundation, then start all over on the house, maybe with some of the old materials, but with a better result. Best I can tell, ours is an era of examining and testing the foundations. And here's the truth as I see it. Though the house of American democracy is beautiful in its potential, its foundation is a horror. This house was founded on a government-endorsed attempted genocide and built on the backs of enslaved people. I know how radical, maybe even knee-jerk liberal that sounds to some folks. I'm well familiar with the defensive feeling that may rise in the American spirit at hearing this claim, but for the life of me, I can't find the untruth in it. I'll give one thing to people defensive for our country. It didn't start with us. The doctrine of discovery was put forward by Pope Nicholas V in 1452. It was an international law which said that God had spoken and ordered that non-Christian territories were available for the taking by Christian armies, no matter who lived there before. It saw the Christian conquest of the world not as a human undertaking, but as a celestial battle between God and the forces of evil. By capturing a land and subjugating a people, Christian crusaders were ultimately saving the souls of the people there. It's easy to tell yourself that when you're becoming unspeakably rich with every new acquisition. Everything from animals to land to human beings were means to the end of spreading European Christian ideals. 40 years after the Pope made his declaration, Christopher Columbus claimed to have discovered an already inhabited property. He subjugated some native people, killed many more, and assumed that God had sent him to make Native American cultures appear more European, more Christian. In 1823, many years later, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Johnson versus McIntosh that the same doctrine of discovery initially used to justify European conquests applied to the actions of the United States of America. The ruling said, "The United States then have unequivocally acceded to that great and broad rule by which its civilized inhabitants now hold this country. They hold and assert in themselves the title by which it was acquired. They maintain, as all others have maintained, that discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy, either by purchase or conquest, and gave also a right to such a degree of sovereignty as the circumstances of the people would allow them to exercise." Cracks in the foundation of this American house. The UUA website reports that Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who was a Unitarian, lived from 1779 to 1845, wrote, "As infidels, heathens, and savages, the Native Americans were not allowed to possess the prerogatives belonging to absolute sovereign and independent nations," end quote. Few of us are untouched, few of us not complicit in these early American atrocities. The house of American democracy is built on shifting sands, to say the very least. We've often treated everything and every person as a resource. The tendrils of our original national sin can be seen in today's news. Immigrant children and their families are treated by our government as a resource and are used to generate billions of dollars by being housed in private prisons. African people for generations have been treated as resources, first traded as slaves, and now imprisoned at stunningly disproportionate rates to other populations. Again, all to the benefit of private prison corporations and conservative politicians. We treat the land as a resource and continue to use it up in ways that are unsustainable in the long term with no plan to stop. The colonization mindset is proving to be an addiction that may kill us. Slowly, though, painfully slowly, whispers of a new way of being are heard. There are cries of pain as widespread access to unfiltered information makes clear just how tightly patriarchal colonialism has us in its grasp. But something new is trying to be born. Shifting from a celebration of the colonizer Christopher Columbus to Indigenous Peoples Day, on a day on which we're invited to celebrate America's native peoples and work to overcome the effects of colonization. This shift is an important marker on the path toward repairing our foundation. It is a symbol of what could be. Plenty of powerful people are shouting that we must move ahead with the construction of this American house. The foundation has served them well, and they would not see it changed. They implement laws that justify their bigotry on religious bases. They won't bake your cake if you're gay and you can't make them. Conservative Christians still looking to conquer subjects. They bristle at anti-racism initiatives and refuse to consider the ways to have our government reflect the population of the country it claims to serve. They appoint judges who have no business on the bench, but who have vowed to protect the interests of the already powerful. Not unrelated, they colonize women's bodies. In true Handmaid's Tale fashion, a room full of white men last year got together to debate women's health care policy in the nation's capital. This, it seems to me, is in large part what the Me Too movement is about. Courageously telling difficult stories, dismantling the structures that have men believing that they have some divine right to women's affection. All of it is deeply connected to the mindset that had Pope Nicholas decree that white European male explorers had the right to whatever they saw in their conquests. Our foundation is unsound. The necessary work of demolition continues. Fueled by the widespread availability of information, old systems that have historically been dominated by wealthy white men are being held in the light of day and found wanting. In Senate hearing rooms and the elevators of halls of legislative power, in boardrooms and courtrooms, at kitchen tables and in bedrooms across our country, I believe that although the white male colonial mentality is loud right now, such power is beginning its historical decline. Now, we should not deceive ourselves. The powerful are fighting back. They will scratch and claw to retain power because, as I've heard said, when you've been privileged, equality feels like oppression. But still, this is a time of dismantling. I don't know what things are going to look like when they're finally put back together. The work is likely not to be finished in my lifetime, though I will commit to being faithful to it as long as I draw breath. It is time we white men ourselves advocated for the defeat of colonialism, patriarchy, and violence. In fact, let me talk privately to my fellow fellas in the congregation and all those men watching around the country in our online feed. That's true. Guys, there's no need to be defensive right now as these old ways of being are dismantled, as those who have for too long been colonized are claiming their power. Now, I know it feels scary standing here as cracks appear in the foundation of the system that has benefited especially us, especially white men, for so long. It's scary. But it should be enough that our sisters are in pain. However, don't we know that this patriarchal system, guys, hurts us too? Just one sort of silly example. Some years ago, I came home after a day full of meetings and such to find that my amazing wife had pulled the toilet off the flange, turned it upside down, and was repairing a plumbing problem that we had been experiencing. I should have thanked her and fetched her a glass of wine. I should have cooked her a meal and otherwise stayed out of her way. I should have given thanks to the divine for her presence in my life. But my first instinct, you're going to be shocked by this, you all. My first instinct was to take over. Let me help. Let me lift that. But with Heather's assistance, I stifled that instinct. Because, friends, she is better at those things than I am. The culture I was raised in tells me I need to do all the fixing around the house. But that's stupid. Now, I'm not lazy, usually, but I would rather do something else. So while Heather fixes the plumbing, I can cook dinner, which I love to do. How great is life beyond the confines of traditional gender roles? My wife is a strong woman, and she has trained me well. The proof is in the conversation that we had a couple days ago. She was sitting at the dining room table working on a broken part from our air compressor, and she said something like, "This thing just isn't going to work." I was cooking, and I said, "Hey, you want me to come over there and pretend to help you fix it?" She said, "Absolutely not." She's pretty awesome and very direct. The effects, though, of patriarchy and conquest mindset hurt men in more serious ways, too. We're told it's not manly to cry or talk about feelings, so emotionally stunted men with no outlet for their very human feelings are, for example, more likely to experience alcoholism than women. Men who experience sexual assault or domestic violence are shamed into silence just as women are, but for different reasons. Men who have the great gift of staying home with their children are sometimes shamed or feel an internalized pressure to find full-time work as quickly as they can. As one recent article reports, there's no denying that the patriarchy is set up to benefit men. However, gender norms are just as rigid for men as they are for women, and the consequences can be deadly. Some have argued that the high rate of completed suicide for men could be traced back to the cult of masculinity, which causes men to be less likely to seek help for emotional problems. As much as men may benefit from patriarchal societies on the surface, it's clear that the disadvantages far outweigh the advantages. Fortunately, the article continues, there's a movement dedicated to dismantling the patriarchy. Feminism, fancy that. We still have a long way to go. But if we work together, perhaps we'll find ourselves in a society that doesn't discourage men from showing emotion or shame women for doing so. End quote. Squelching the need to conquer everything around us, working to dismantle patriarchal, colonialist mindsets, will help people of all genders find more gentle and soul-feeding ways of being in the world. Colonialist and patriarchal mentality needs everyone to fit in pre-assigned social boxes so they can either be marked as allies or conquered. But we can be a gentle, angry, persistent people. We will especially need to be persistent because this is not quick work. This dismantling of patriarchal colonialism and the reassembling of the American democracy will take a long, long time. Forces of discrimination, in fact, it's my opinion, will not finally be conquered. The question is not, will we see this through to the end? We will likely not see the end. The question is, will we be faithful to the work while we live? Will we keep paying attention when it gets like it is now? Will we seek help and a listening ear when we feel overwhelmed? Will we get back out there once our energies are replenished? Will we return again and again and again to be part of the great force of love that pushes back against tyranny generation after generation after generation? I know that we can do that. As you go about your work, may the words of author and activist L.R. Nost give you strength. She says, "Do not be dismayed by the brokenness of the world. All things break, and all things can be mended. Not with time, as they say, but with intention. So go. Love intentionally, extravagantly, unconditionally. The broken world waits in darkness for the light that is in you." Amen.